So continuing on with the origins of civil rights, Brown versus Board of Education, like I said, it's a major power player and what's really going to take place throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. Going back to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, what we call the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment giving former slave citizenship, and the 15th Amendment giving all men the right to vote were a step in the right direction. But with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, officially ruling that separate but equal was constitutional, that's really going to kind of put civil rights and African American progression on the back burner. And it's really not until we get to the 1940s and 1950s with cases like Brown versus Board of Education, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, that civil rights is really going to start to kind of gain a little bit of steam. And of course, the NAACP wasn't the only organization that's going to be pushing, for civil rights. You're going to have several organizations that get created throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s that are going to be pushing for more civil rights. And James Farmer is really going to be kind of one of the main ones. They're going to find CORE, which becomes known as the Congress of Racial Equality. And they're going to be protesting segregation in restaurants by using sit-ins. So pretty much any public place that you can think of was segregated. Movie theaters, segregated. Doctor's offices, segregated. Libraries, schools. Again, any sort of like public entity where you're like, hey, we could just sort of walk in at any time. Those were all segregated. And restaurants were another big one. Typically, it was like blacks would eat at a certain part of the restaurant, or for some restaurants, blacks weren't allowed in at all. And so as a result, CORE is really going to start to challenge those segregation laws that were existing in the restaurants by using sit-ins. So what exactly is a sit-in? Well, they would either go into an all-white restaurant or go to an all-white area, typically at the counter. Kind of think of like old school diners, and they would sit at the counter that was all white, and they would ask to be served, whether it's a cup of coffee, breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever it may be. And you can kind of figure out how this is going to go. They would sit, they would ask for service, the waitress would deny it, and then they would refuse to leave. And that became the sit-in. The big thing about these sit-in movements was that they were peaceful. So they would sit there, people would spit on them, throw food at them, take them out of their chairs and beat them. Eventually the cops would come and arrest those who were participating in the sit-ins, all in an effort to desegregate the restaurant business. Was it only blacks that participated in these sit-ins? No, absolutely not. And we'll actually watch a clip, I want to say in a day or two, that kind of demonstrates what these sit-in movements were actually like. But they were very intense. They were very hard to sit through. It's one of those things like when you watch it, I don't know if I would have been able to have done something like that. It takes a lot of strength and a lot of great will. But the sit-ins are eventually going to be very effective in desegregating restaurants throughout the country. But of course, I would say one of the most famous ones and ones that pretty much everybody knows is none other than Rosa Parks. I'm sure that you've all heard the story before. Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was on her way home to work. She had taken a seat on the bus, because a white passenger had asked her to, basically move to the back of the bus. She was tired and she was exhausted and she refused. She ends up getting arrested. And then, of course, the Montgomery bus boycotts end up starting. That is the story that we have all been told. But what if I told you there was a little bit more to the story? That it's not exactly as history has painted it throughout your whole lives. Rosa Parks was not initially supposed to be the person that started the bus boycotts. You're probably like, wait a minute, it started. Didn't she just refuse to give up her seat because she was exhausted? Not exactly. Rosa Parks was a very well-respected member of the NAACP. She had been a part of that chapter in Montgomery, Alabama. And again, they had been looking for ways to challenge segregation laws, right? We see it with cases like Brown versus Board of Education. We see it with James Farmer and the CORE organization. They're going to participate in sit-ins. The Montgomery bus boycott, again, is going to be another big way that we're going to challenge these Jim Crow segregation laws that say that because of the color of my skin, I'm not given the same rights as everybody else. And initially, the NAACP was going to use this 16-year-old black girl, and I believe her name was Brittany, and I could be very wrong by that. But then something ends up happening to the 16-year-old black girl. Turns out she is pregnant. And all of a sudden, the NAACP realizes we can't use her. And you might be thinking, oh yeah, safety of the kid, whatever it may be. No, they couldn't use her because they're like, she's going to perpetuate this stereotype that, black people are inferior, right? They don't know what they're doing. She's having a child out of wedlock, what we sort of call a bastard child. This isn't going to be good for the movement. So they end up scrapping her, and they're going to turn to Rosa Parks. Again, like I said, she was older. She was a well-respected member of the NAACP, and they sort of realized that if she's going to sort of be the face, it's going to be a good face to have. And so on December 1st of 1955, Rosa Parks, she's going to take that seat on the bus. Again, she's going to refuse to move, and the Montgomery bus boycotts are officially going to kick off. And then Martin Luther King Jr., he's going to be elected to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association, which negotiated with city leaders to end segregation on public buses. So like I said, any sort of public entity that you can think of, that's what these civil rights organizations were challenging. They're like, if someone in the privacy of their own home doesn't want to let somebody in because of the color of their skin or because they're gay or because they have a certain religious affiliation, whatever, but public institutions like schools, like buses, should be available to all members of the public, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of religion, whatever it may be. And as with the video that we saw about a month ago, that Happy Days video, we know Martin Luther King Jr. really he really did become the face of the civil rights movement and of this organization. And this Montgomery bus boycott is really going to what's going to solidify Martin Luther King Jr. as a leader of the movement. It's going to last for over a year, a total of 381 days, and it was incredibly tough. I mean, people relied on public transportation to get them to and from, whether it was school, the grocery store, work, whatever it may be. And it's kind of, I would say, probably something hard for us to imagine because especially in California, public transportation isn't something that's a big, like widely used, right? We've talked about kind of putting in that railway train, but it's never happened. But in a lot of other places, especially on the East Coast, public transportation is huge. If you go to like Boston, New York, DC, most of those people don't own cars. They use the subway system or some type of public transportation. So the fact that these people couldn't use public transportation and were having to walk everywhere, so it might mean waking up a couple of hours early to try to go to work. Or if somebody was lucky enough to have a car, then you would try to carpool and, maybe they take several different trips to try to get people to work or to school or to their job or whatever it may be. It was tough, and it was tough for people to hold out for well over a year, but they did it. And after 381 days, those public buses are officially going to be desegregated, which means regardless of the color of your skin, you could sit wherever you want. A big part of them is that they're going to remain peaceful and avoid violence, which for a lot of major civil rights, I would say, acts or bills, whatever you want to call them, that get passed in the 50s and 60s, in large part, a lot of them are going to be passed by nonviolent, peaceful protesting. Did all of them remain that way? No, but those were certainly looked upon more favorably than those that did turn violent. I would really kind of compare that to the protests that we've been seeing, especially with Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests over the past year. The ones that have turned violent, people haven't really been happy about. The ones that have been peaceful, no one has really had anything to say about it, but it's the burning down of stores or smashing of windows and cars and things like that turn people off to those causes because they're like, well, if I support this cause and this is what people are doing, I'm not really a fan with that. But the ones that tend to remain peaceful, people can kind of get on board with those causes. And like I said, Martin Luther King Jr., his name is going to be solidified right after that Montgomery bus boycott movement. Some interesting facts about Martin Luther King Jr. Martin is actually not his first name. His first name is actually Michael, but he ended up changing his name to Martin Luther. If you are Christian or know anything about the Christianity religion, or you might recall this from world history last year, Martin Luther and his 95 Thesis, he played a big role in Christianity really gaining ground in Europe. So Martin Luther King Jr. changed his name to reflect Martin Luther, who, of course, like I said, had a big push in Christianity, becoming the main religion, especially throughout Europe, hundreds of years ago. Martin Luther King Jr. was incredibly smart. He's actually going to graduate from high school at the age of 15 and attend college, and he's going to go to Boston University, and eventually he'll earn a PhD in theology. To earn a degree in theology is basically you're earning a degree in religion. So the fact that he had earned his doctorate degree in religion, again, tells you just how important, the Bible, faith, God, all those different things were really important to him. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to believe that the only moral way to end segregation was with nonviolence. And of course, he's going to talk about this in his very famous letters from a Birmingham jail, because he was arrested several times in protest. Martin Luther King Jr. maybe wasn't the guy who was going around, knocking on doors to try to gain support or making phone calls, but he certainly showed up, to big protests and to big movements and was arrested, tens of dozens of times and thrown in jail. And when he's in Birmingham prison, he writes this letter, and you guys might have read it in your English classes. I'm not sure yet, but in it, he was talking about how people were telling him, wait your turn. You got to wait, just give it a few more years. We're in the midst of this Cold War, and we're, trying to fight off communism and things like that. Like, we don't really have time to be focusing on civil rights because we're in the middle of this Cold War against the Soviets. Like, you should just wait your turn. And Martin Luther King Jr. was like, we've been waiting for 100 years and nothing has happened, right? With the Civil War, yeah, slavery was abolished, but then you get these Jim Crow laws that get passed and segregation takes place. How is that a step in the right direction? It's not. He kind of took the approach that the women did with the 19th Amendment. If you remember, they kept saying, the men got the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. We were told to wait our turn. And guess what? We've now been waiting like 40, 50 years. Martin Luther King Jr. really had the same approach. He was like, we are being told to wait, but how much longer do we have to wait for things to be right? We're not talking about just ending segregation. That's what should happen. And again, because he was a man of God, he's like, God doesn't talk about like segregating and things like that based on your race. So therefore, we need to end these segregation laws. And he really encouraged people to disobey unrighteous laws. If it is an unjust law, disobey it. So having to stop at a stop sign because kids are crossing the street, that is a just law. You should obey that. But for the law that says that you can't enter a library or you can't go to the school because of the color of your skin, that is an unjust law and you need to break it. Because if you don't, we're never going to be able to challenge this segregation and these Jim Crow laws. Kind of another interesting fact about Martin Luther King Jr., he unfortunately famously gets assassinated in April of 1968. He was actually almost murdered about 10 years earlier. This woman who was legitimately crazy, she comes up to him. She's like, are you Martin Luther King Jr.? He goes, yes. She had a letter opener with her, stabbed him like in the heart, basically, like a centimeter away. And he ended up making it to the hospital. He survived, but the doctors had told him if he had so much as sneezed, that letter opener basically would have touched his heart and he likely would have died. So lucky for him, and really for us, he was able to live like another 10 years. And Martin Luther King Jr. was also very smart in that in order to get support for Jim Crow laws to end, you're going to need public opinions on your side. If they don't favor you, they're not going to support you. So he's like, if we can continue to remain nonviolent and peaceful, chances are we're going to get the public on board and supporting us in ending these segregation laws. And so the main organization that Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be in charge of is going to be the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, known as the SCLC. Of course, it's going to be led by King, and churches are going to play a huge role in the movement. I would say the churches during the civil rights movement become what we sort of call grassroots organization, where you kind of just get your average people together, but then once you get so many, it really does become a very strong movement. The SCLC is going to have two main goals. The one, of course, is to eliminate segregation, so get rid of those Jim Crow laws. We start to see those things happening with instances like the Brown versus Board of Education case. Of course, it's going to take 3 years before schools finally start to make an attempt to integrate, but again, it's a step in the right direction. You see it with instances like Jackie Robinson, who's going to be the first Black Major League Baseball player in 1947. Again, it was a step in the right direction. So they want to end these segregation laws. And then the second thing that the SCLC wants to do is encourage Blacks to vote. That's going to be the big thing. If you want your voice heard, if you want a voice in your government, whether it's the federal government, the state, your city, whatever it may be, you got to vote. If you don't vote, your voice is not heard. Putting something on your Instagram stories or on your Snapchat or liking a Facebook post or whatever, those things are all nice. They don't create change. Votes create change. Laws create change. And so if you don't vote, your voice isn't heard. And those in the civil rights movement understood that. It's getting elected officials to get on board to pass laws that are going to end segregation, or to pass laws that's going to make it easier for people of color to vote. Those are the things that matter. It's not sitting at home going, yeah, I support this. No, you have to actually get out, participate, and do something in order to create change. And Emmett Till is going to be another, I would say sort of tipping point during the civil rights movement with his death in 1955. we're actually going to watch a little bit of this video. This is from Time Magazine. That's going to kind of go over his death, the meaning of his death and kind of the impact that it had on the civil rights movement.
I believe that the whole United States is mourning with me. And if the death of my son can mean something to the other unfortunate people all over the world, then for him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him just to have died.
Emmett Till, 14, was kidnapped and killed allegedly for wolf whistling at the wife of accused Roy Bryant.
It's not just that they discover his body and that he's been killed. He has been brutally, brutally beaten. As a criminal defense attorney, when we look at crimes, we often try to put together a picture about what happened, and it takes a lot of hatred and a lot of rage to do the kind of violence that was done to Emmett Till. Being a black boy in the American South could be quite perilous. The allegation that Emmett Till was being social with a white woman was considered an affront, a threat to the racial order. And I think the shock of his death was compounded by the brutality of his death. Emmett's mother couldn't actually conform to the conventions of the time, and she did something really quite remarkable. She made the really unorthodox choice of having a funeral with an open casket that was going to be very widely publicized, that was going to be attended by the national press. She wanted civil rights leaders and political leaders to see what they did to her child. She invited David Jackson and Jet Magazine to take pictures of this child's battered body. And these images were widely circulated. Jet Magazine was a publication that was primarily produced and distributed to the African American community that had been trying to educate the rest of the country about the horrors of segregation and racial violence and lynching in the American South. And the images were really, really challenging. It was the kind of visual that you didn't typically see. You certainly didn't see it outside of a war zone, and you certainly didn't see it with children. His face was grotesque. You could see eyes, but you couldn't really distinguish all of his facial features. That's how much violence he had been subjected to. Emmett's mother's presence in the photo is really important because she's really giving witness to victimization and violence. The other images that Emmett's mother provided just created this notion of a very respectable young boy who was trying to make the very best impression on everyone he met. The juxtaposition of a little boy in a suit and a tie with his battered face was a stark image that made it really impossible for anyone who saw it to be silent about it. Mainstream publications like Look and Life began talking about this issue. It became an issue that elected officials were being questioned about. These images made it impossible for white families in other parts of the country to stay indifferent, to stay neutral.
How would you like to earn $10,000 a month? Or better yet,
Sorry, guys.
$100,000 a month like Catherine here?
Never has this quiet little cotton-growing community of Mississippi seen so much publicity and so much excitement as in the past few days. Nearly 200 of the town's 500 or 600 residents have packed into the courthouse to hear the day's proceedings.
Do you have any evidence bearing on this case?
I do know that this is my son
How long do you expect to be here?
until the trial is over.
Bryant and his half-brother, J.W. Milam, were acquitted by this jury. And subsequently, even though they admitted taking the boy from the house, they were freed of kidnap charges.
The inability to hold anyone accountable for his murder and the comfort with which the men who killed him were able to talk about the violence was just adding to the injury. They weren't just killing a boy. They're expressing something rooted in this decades of animosity and fear and anger.
A boy, a 14-year-old boy, was killed brutally. And one of our objectives here is to see to it that that boy, whose picture you see there, does not die an inconspicuous death, and that his case will be remembered and something will be done about it.
These images became powerful forces in organizing a new level of commitment and resistance. The brutal murder of Emmett Till really pushed Rosa Parks to a deeper level of activism.
So you can see Emmett Till there and a little bit of his story. So Emmett Till grew up in Chicago, Illinois, which at the time was a lot safer than heading down to the South. His uncle Moses lived in Mississippi. He goes to visit him for the summer. He ends up going to this, little kind of like general grocery store where you might get like candy and things like that. And he runs into Carolyn Bryant. He supposedly whistles at her, says, "Hey, baby," or something along those lines. She ends up telling her husband, Roy Bryant, and Roy and his cousin, they're going to take Emmett Till out of his home in the middle of the night. They beat him. They tie barbed wire around him. They shoot him and drown his body in the river. Looking at those photos, you can tell just how stark that is to go from this to this, of how bad his beating was and how much he was tortured. But of course, this is Mississippi during the 1950s. At that time, blacks could not serve on juries. So you're going to have an all-white jury that's going to be used in the trial of Roy Bryant or J.W. Milliam. And then, of course, by the end of it, they're going to acquit both Roy Bryant and J.W. Milliam. Acquit, saying that they are not guilty of his murder. A couple years later, Life magazine, they are going to basically give Roy and JW about $5,000. And they're like, "Yep, we killed the kid, and here's how we did it. He got what he deserved." And of course, they could do that. Why is that the case? All right, something from earlier in the school year. Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, the double jeopardy clause. You cannot be charged for the same crime twice. So Roy Bryant and Milliam have already been charged for the murder of Emmett Till. So once they were acquitted and found not guilty, they could walk out and easily and freely admit what it is that they did. And of course they did. They accepted responsibility for it, but because of that clause to the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, they could not then again be tried for their murder and be sent to jail. Carolyn Bryant, who, by the way, is actually still alive. She's in her late 80s. Years ago, she was found by an author who was writing a book on Emmett Till's murder, and she basically said that there was nothing that he did that he deserved what he got, because Carolyn Bryant took the witness stand and basically kind of led the jury to believe that Emmett Till was trying to rape her. And that was never the case, but unfortunately you have segregation in the deep Mississippi South. They bought a hook, line, and sinker and acquitted both Roy Bryant and J.W. Milliam. Emmett Till has been known in popular culture. You have several rappers that have referenced him. Kanye West referenced him in Through the Wire. I know Lil Wayne took a little bit of heat for how he had referenced Emmett Till. And actually Lovecraft Country, a show on HBO, they actually just recently kind of recreated Emmett Till's death to kind of show how like graphic and horrific it is. But when people saw this image, it was, and his mother, Mammy, did this intentionally of, look what racism did to my kid. Right? This shouldn't be happening to a kid that's 13, 14 years old. So when people saw this, they were horrified. And again, it's going to start really kind of pushing that, pushing people to act, that we need to do something to change these laws that are unjust.